Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. So Boris Johnson was speaking about his plans as Prime Minister yesterday, and in it he was championing his ideas for opportunities in a post-Brexit Britain. Naturally, as with all politicians, he was light on the details, so what I'd like to do is take a look at what he said and what he actually means by it. So one thing he said is that we should roll back the influence of the state. Now that is a fairly typical right-wing politician stance, of course. You know, the right wing of politics effectively defined as opposition to state infrastructure. But what is it about government that right-wing people oppose? Well, it's regulation and taxation. Regulation means you have to treat your workers like human beings. It also means that you can't mislead or even outright lie in your advertising to customers or what you say to them. It means your products have to meet certain standards. And let's put it another way. If you're a Brexiteer and you think EU regulations are bad, can you name one EU regulation that is harmful to the bulk of British people? As for taxation, that of course means you're paying to support the society that you are enjoying a life of luxury at the expense of. You'd really rather just enjoy the luxury without having to pay for it, but taxation pays for public services, and those public services serve the bulk of the population. So he's arguing that the bulk of the population should suffer so that people who already have a lot of wealth can have a little bit more that they won't even use and pump back into the economy. He also said that we should scrap EU rules stopping the government from backing British businesses. Just the sort of thing that appeals to the jingoistic Brexit crowd, of course. Oh yes, we should be able to back British businesses. But what does he mean by that? I mean, those rules he's talking about, first of all, are purely for private contracts for public services. Say the bits of the NHS that they keep privatising, or the railways, for example. And those rules say that the contract should be awarded to the company that can deliver the service at the standard that the government sets for the best price. So in other words, to get rid of that regulation means he wants to give the contracts to his friends and party donors who would not meet those criteria because either their company is incapable of delivering the service or because they charge too much for it. So he's talking about giving contracts to companies who charge too much, and so that of course raises the tax burden on us all. I say all, I don't mean of course the wealthy who will get massive tax breaks, but also giving those contracts to companies who can't deliver the service. But although those rules do actually exist, they are EU rules, the Conservatives break them all the time anyway. Anyone heard of the ferry company, for example, awarded a contract which didn't have any ferries or indeed any experience of using ferries? In addition, Tory party donors get lucrative government contracts all the time. The deal is you donate, say, £100,000 and you get a £5 or £10 million government contract. For example, recently it was noted that a party donor, Mustafa Mohammed, who gave Jeremy Hunt £20,000 and then received a £7.3 million NHS contract whilst Hunt was Health Secretary. And something that should come as no surprise, of course, is the company of that particular donor has no accounts filed in the UK as all its operations are offshore. Besides, when it comes to government contracts, there is something else to consider. Let's say you adopt a policy of only awarding contracts to British companies and the Brexiteers go, yes, of course we should. Of course we should. Best for Britain. And I have to repeat that, again, we're only talking about public contracts here. Private businesses award their subcontracts to whoever they like, with or without regulation. And also, Johnson is talking about massively reducing public spending anyway, so there won't be anywhere near as many of those contracts anyway. So the net loss of those contracts will mean that the net loss to British businesses would be evident anyway. But no, there's another consideration. If we are only giving those contracts to British companies, the countries abroad will play tit for tat. They will stop awarding their contracts to British companies. Now, it should come as no surprise to learn that the world is bigger than the UK and that there are more British businesses with overseas contracts than there are foreign businesses with British contracts. So the result of that policy would be a net loss to British businesses globally. It would also make those crucial trade negotiations quite impossible. Can you imagine trotting off to China and saying, we'd like a trade deal, please? And they go, oh, right, really? We've just heard you've stopped a load of Chinese companies getting government contracts. Yeah, we did that. Can we have a trade deal, please? No. He also said, perhaps the most important is to give people more freedom to spend their own money. which all sounds very nice, the Brexit crowd. Of course we should have the freedom to spend our own money, without stopping to think that we already do. What sort of extra freedoms is he talking about? The only example I can think of is when the Conservatives freed up spending that I can think of is when they encouraged people to release equity in their pension pot early. That was encouraging people to take from their pensions that might only be thinking very short term. But the impact of that is that people who are a bit hard up reduce their already meagre pensions for the future, and then they will struggle further down the line. And what for? So that they could reduce the spending on social care for the elderly. That's why they did it. They were basically saying to the elderly, right, we need to scale back on public spending on your care. They say, well, we haven't got any care then. So they say, well, we'll let you release some money to pay for it yourself from your pension pot. Obviously storing up massive problems for the future, but that's okay because those ministers won't be around then. I mean, what other freedoms are there? He said people should have more freedom to invest and start up their own businesses. In what way does the EU stop this exactly? The only businesses that I can't invest in are the ones that the American government tells me not to, like Iranian companies, for example. The EU don't stop me. He then said, so I think the tax burden is very high, the regulatory burden is very high. And so we come back to those taxes. Polls regularly show that people in Britain are in favour of taxation when it is used to fund good public services. We're less happy about it being used to fund rich Etonians' bank accounts, of course. But Johnson wants to reduce the taxation for services and divert it to its mates' bank accounts. Offshore accounts, of course. In fact, a poll last year showed that 60% of Britons are in favour of increased taxation if it would mean the NHS were better funded. The poll showed that 90% believed that the NHS was facing a financial crisis. So the majority of people don't feel that the tax burden is too high. In fact, they don't feel that it's high enough. So this very high tax burden, it's not something that the majority of the company feel, just as rich mates who want something for nothing. So the major content of his speech was essentially to appeal to those who are deluded into thinking that EU membership is bad for Britain by promoting policies that would actually harm British businesses, which is why British businesses are calling for us to stay in the EU. It would harm British citizens, which is why British citizens are calling for another referendum. And it would harm British standing around the globe, as we've already seen. A typical Brexiteer speech then. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, and until next time, I'll see you later.